conscious. Jesus, that happens all the time. What does that mean? Well, you know, and it's an autonomous thing in some sense, you know, like if you get depressed or if you get really anxious, you don't have any control over that. It's like it sweeps up over you and pulls you down. Why down? Well, down is where you go when you're sad. You don't go up. Man, I'm up today. Oh, that's too bad. No, it's man, I'm down today. And well, that's partly this, and it's partly because this is subordinate, and it's partly because down is closer to the ground and farther from the sky. Like there's all sorts of reasons you're feeling down rather than up. Up is where you're aiming, right? You aim up, you don't aim down. Well, the reason those phrases make sense is because they're locked deeply into this underlying structure of imagination. And well, those are the archetypal structures according to Jung. And I think that he's, as far as I can tell, he's dead accurate, and I think we understand the biology of such things much better than we did. So there's more representations. She's quite the friendly creature. That's Kelly. I like this representation better. Those are heads, by the way, and hands. So she sort of represents, well, very complex things. She represents death. She represents transformation. In this, I really like this representation. I think it's brilliant. So imagine that what the people were doing who formulated these representations, what they were trying to do was to make a representation of the domain of threat itself, right? So that they could deal with the idea that, because we can say threat. Well, what the hell does that mean? Well, threat is the category of all threatening things. And so then you can think about threat, and you can think about threat across all those individual instances, and maybe you can figure out how to deal with threat, right? What's the best way to be in the world so that you most effectively deal with threat? Well, that's sort of like, apart from how do you deal with pain, that's sort of like the ultimate question of human beings. You want to be terrified? No. So you want to be in danger? No. So like you better figure out how to deal with threat. So first of all, you have to conceptualize it. So we'll take a look at this representation. So that's Kelly. Her hair is on fire. Well, fire, you know, that's a numinous phenomena, dangerous but transformative. She's wearing a headdress of skulls. She has a weapon in this hand, and she has a tiger's tongue. She often has a snake around her waist. None of these do, but she often does. But in this case, then that's because, you know, it's a snake. We've already covered that. Well, these things that look like snakes here aren't. You notice how her belly is concave? Well, it's because she's just given birth to this unfortunate person that she happens to be standing on, and she's eating him intestines first. And that's a fire ring, which she is in, and then it's got skulls on the inside of it. It's like, what's that supposed to do? Well, partly it's supposed to represent that which terrifies you. It's like, yeah, fair enough, man, because I don't imagine you saw all those things in there before I explained them, but someone who was familiar with that image would know what it meant. It's like some poor artist was sitting there thinking, well, how do I represent destruction? And it's like, bang, whoa, okay, we'll put that down and then we won't look at it again. So, and then what do you do with this? You make sacrifices to it. And you think, well, that's kind of primitive. You know, first of all, well, that doesn't really exist. Well, it does if it's an amalgam of threat symbols, I can tell you that. It exists, that's for sure. So it exists as an abstraction, if nothing else. Do you offer it sacrifices? Well, what the hell do you think you do? What are you doing in class? Why aren't you like drinking vodka and snorting cocaine? You know, because you could be doing that. Instead, here you are, listening to me, you know, slaving away in university. You're young. It's like, really? You've got nothing better to do than sit there? You know, well, what you're willing to forego today's pleasure for tomorrow's advantage. And that's what sacrifice is. And human beings discovered that dramatically first, you know, like we were apes, for God's sake. We didn't just leap up and think, oh, we better save for tomorrow. You know, it took thousands of years for that idea to emerge. And it emerged in dramatic form. And it was sort of like, well, society is sort of like a god. No, they weren't thinking this through. It was like, if you're going to represent society, well, it's like this masculine God that's always judging the hell out of you, that's everywhere all at the same time. It's like, yeah, that's true, absolutely. And what do you have to do with it? Well, you have to give it what it wants. Why do you have to give it what it wants? Because it'll crush you if you don't. And that's exactly right. And if you're lucky and you give it the right sacrifice, then it'll smile on you and you get to have a good life. And that was the major discovery of mankind, man. That was a killer discovery. It was like the discovery of the future. You know, we discovered the future as a place. And it was a place that you could bargain with. You can bargain with the future. Wow, that's just, what an idea that is. You know, it's so unlikely. Well, how do you bargain with the future? Well, you give it what it wants. And, you know, some of that's you maintain your social relationship, and, you know, you make yourself useful to other people, and you shape yourself so that you can cooperate with people, and you don't act impulsively, and maybe you squirrel something away for the next harvest, even if you're hungry, and, you know, and then the future isn't hell, and you make the proper sacrifices. And so if you sacrifice to Kelly, then she turns into her opposite and showers benevolence on you. And that's Mother Nature, right? It's like, look out for Mother Nature, man. You know, 2 weeks out in the bush right now and you're dead, and it's not pleasant. And then if it's the spring, you last longer, but the bugs eat you, and so that's not very fun either. So nature, you know, it's bent on your destruction. But if you treat it properly and carefully and make the right sacrifices, then maybe one of her trees will offer you some fruit, and that would be okay. And so believe me, lots of people died trying to figure that out. So here's another way of looking at it. So I said, you know, order and chaos, known, unknown, explored territory, unexplored territory. I love this. This is the Taoist symbol. It's a symbol of being. And being isn't reality as you would conceptualize it as a scientist. It's more like reality as it manifests itself to you as a living thing, which is completely different. You know, science extracts out all the subjectivity. All that is there is an array of objective facts of equivalent value, and that's part of its method, but that's not the world in which you live. The world in which you live is full of motivation and emotion. It's full of terror and pain and joy and frustration and other people, that's for sure. And so that's the real world. And so, well, that's what this is. It's the real world. And what is it made out of? Well, it's made out of all those things you know that can get out of hand, you know, because the explored territory and the known can get so damn tight that it's nothing but a tyrant. And then it's all those things you don't know, and that's pretty exciting because, you know, you want to go find out some things you don't know, and that adds a lot of spice to life. You want a little adventure. You don't want to go out with someone who's so predictable that you know everything about them in a week, you know, unless you're hyper-conservative. You want to go out with someone who's they're a little erratic, like not too erratic, let's say. They're a little dangerous, perhaps not too dangerous, but some of that at least. You want predictability with a bit of unpredictability in there. Well, and that's exactly what this means. It's like that's predictability with a little unpredictability in it. And what that also means is that what you know can be turned into what you don't know, just like that. And that's going to happen to you lots of times in your life, man. When someone close to you dies suddenly, it's like poof, order turns into chaos, and now you're in chaos, and what the hell are you going to do there? And that's a good question, because you need to know what to do there, because you're going to be there. And it happens to you when your dreams fall apart, you know, I mean your dreams for your life, or, you know, when you discover something awful about yourself that you didn't know, or, you know, it flips on you all the time, and in small ways sometimes. You know, you have a fight with a friend, or in big ways that wipe you out for, well, indefinitely sometimes, because you can fall into chaos and never get out. You know, that's the people who are trapped in the belly of the beast. It isn't necessary that when you descend into chaos that you learn something and you get back out. You could just be stuck there suffering until you die. And that's, you know, I wouldn't recommend that, you know, it's something to avoid, but it happens to people all the time, all the time. You see them wandering around, you know, shattered on the streets of Toronto, you know, they're done. They're in chaos. And there's so much chaos around them that you won't even go near them. The chaos spreads like 8 feet around them. And so when you see someone like that, you're like, well, first, we're not going to look too closely, and people like that often don't like you to look at them, because that also helps them remember where they are, and that's no pleasant thing. And you're going to just stay away from that. Maybe you'll cross the street. Maybe you'll keep your head down. Whatever. You're not going anywhere near that chaos, and no bloody wonder, you know. And you don't think about it much after you pass it, because it's a hell of a thing to think about, and what are you going to do about it anyways? You don't know what to do about it. You might just make it worse. Well, so chaos, you know, that's the other half of life, and it can turn into order, sometimes better order. That's actually what you do when you explore, right? You explore, you find out something new, not too Pandora boxy. You know, you bite off as much as you can chew, but no more. And so that rearranges the way you look at the world, but you're doing it voluntarily, so you can kind of tolerate the recalibration. And you strengthen the order, right? Because now you become more competent. And I would say that you're trying to live on the edge between order and chaos. And I mean, that's a real place. That's it's a meta place. But it's more real than places, because it's so old. It's such an old place. It really exists, and your nervous system knows that. It sees the world this way. In fact, the right hemisphere is roughly specialized for chaos, and the left hemisphere is roughly specialized for order, which is why the left hemisphere tends to have the linguistic elements, and why people are right-handed. And the right hemisphere has a more diffuse structure. It's more associated with negative emotion and imagination, and the two communicate between each other through the corpus callosum, and the right hemisphere appears to update the left hemisphere kind of slowly, often in dreams. And so if you are hurt, if your right hemisphere is hurt, for example, back here in the parietal lobe, then you lose the left part of your body. You can't move it anymore, but you also lose the idea that you have a left part of your body. So it's like blindness. It's a blindness to the left. And so if someone comes along and says, you know, you're not moving your left arm, you're going to say, yeah, well, my arthritis is bothering me today. You haven't moved it for 6 months. Well, my arthritis is bothering today. Or, you know, you're not moving your left foot. It's like, well, you know, I'm too tired. Well, what's happened is the left hemisphere has a representation of the body, and it's not being updated because the part of the brain that would notice that the left is gone because of a stroke, it isn't there anymore. And so the left already has a model, and it's not going to change. It's hard to change your model of yourself. You know, have a tooth pulled. What happens? It's like your damn tongue is in that hole for the next 6 months, fiddling around constantly. And that's because you're rebuilding your neurological model of your body. It's like, try that with your whole left side and see how well you do. You know, so this guy named Ramachandran was experimenting with people like this. And one of the things he did was he was checking their balance, and you can do that by irrigating the ear with cold water, and that makes people go like this, makes their eyes move back and forth because it upsets the vestibular system. And what he found was that if he poured cold water in the left ear of someone with right parietal damage who had left neglect, that they'd all of a sudden sort of wake up catastrophically. They'd have a terrible reaction to the fact that they were paralyzed on the left, and they would know that it had happened and cry and, you know, emit all sorts of distress, and no wonder. And then like 20 minutes later, they'd snap back into their damaged mode of being, and they would not deny, because that isn't really what it is that they couldn't update the model. They just didn't have the neurology for it anymore, so they were back to not noticing that it was gone and coming up with stories about it. And so, well, so that's a good example of how the right and left hemispheres work together and how they're kind of mapped onto this, weirdly enough. So, you know, we're adapted to the meta reality. And so what that would be is we're adapted to that which remains constant across the longest spans of time. And that's not the same things that you see flitting around you day to day. Those are they just like clouds. They're just evaporating, you know. There's things underneath that are more fundamental, realities, like the dominance hierarchy, like the tribe, like the danger outside of society, like the threat that other people pose to you and that you pose to yourself. Those are eternal realities. And we're adapted to those. That's our world, and that's why we express that in stories. And so then you might say, well, how do you adapt yourself to this world? And the answer to that is, and I believe this is a neurological answer, I believe this, that your brain can tell you when you're optimally situated between chaos and order. And the way it tells you that is by producing the sense of engagement and meaning. So let's say there's a place in the environment you should be. Okay, what should that place be? Well, you don't want to be terrified out of your skull, like what good is that? And you know, you don't want to be so comfortable that you might as well sleep. You want to be somewhere where, you know, you're kind of on firm ground here, but over here, you're kind of testing out new territory. And some of you who are exploratory and emotionally stable, you know, you're going to go pretty far out into the unexplored territory without destabilizing yourself, and other people are going to just put a toe in the chaos. And you know, that's neuroticism, basically. That's your sensitivity to threat. That's calibrated differently in different people, and some people are more exploratory than others. That's kind of extroversion and openness working together, and intelligence. So some people are going to tolerate a larger admixture of chaos in their order. Those are liberals, by the way, and I mean that technically. Liberals are more interested in novel chaos, and conservatives are more interested in the stabilization of the structures that already exist. And who's right? Well, it depends on the situation, and that's why conservatives and liberals have to talk to each other, because one of them isn't right and the other wrong. Sometimes the conservatives are right and sometimes the liberals are right, because the environment's going like this. You can't predict the damn thing, so that's why you have to communicate, and that's what a democracy does. It allows people of different temperamental types to communicate and to calibrate their damn societies. So anyways, so let's say you're optimally balanced between chaos and order. So what does that mean? Well, you're stable enough, but you're interested, right? Because a little novelty heightens your anxiety. That wakes you up a bit. That's the adventure part of it. But it also focuses the part of your brain that does exploratory activity. And that's actually associated with pleasure. That's the dopamine circuit. And so if you're optimally balanced, and you know you're there when you're listening to an interesting conversation or you're engaged in one. It's a real conversation. You know, you're saying some things you know, and the other person is saying some things they know, but both of what you know is changing. It's like, wow, that's so interesting. You'll have a conversation like that forever. Or maybe you're reading a book like that. Or you're listening to a piece of music that models that. Because what music does is provide you with predictable forms, multi-level predictable forms that transform just the right amount. And so music is a very representational art form. It says this is what the universe is like. You know, there's a dancing element to it, repetitive, and then cute little variations that sort of surprise and delight you, and you think, wow, that's so cool. And it doesn't matter how nihilistic you are, you know, music still infuses you with a sense of meaning, and that's because it models meaning. That's what it does. That's why we love it. And you know, you can dance to it, and that sort of symbolizes you putting yourself in harmony with these multiple layers of reality and positioning yourself properly. And you like that too, you know, you'll pay for it. Oh boy, I get to go dancing, you know. Oh boy, I get to listen to music. It's like, what the hell are you doing listening to music? What good is that? Well, you think that's a stupid question. I don't care about your dopey criticism. I'm going to listen to some music, right? There's no rational argument against music. It's like, you just don't even think about it. You just walk away from someone who's stupid enough to ask that question. It's like, some things are obvious. Well, why? Okay, so that's pretty fun. So, what mediates between these two domains? Well, that's what consciousness does, as far as I can tell. And that's sort of the individual, and that's the hero. That's another way of thinking about it. It's the logos. That's another way of thinking about it. It's the word that generates order out of chaos at the beginning of time. It's the consciousness that interacting with the matter of the world produces being. That's basically it. That's basically you, for all intents and purposes. How do you do that? Well, the unconscious does it to some degree, you know, because it's with our fantasy that we first meet the unknown, right? Well, look, say you're going out with a new person. It's like, what do? You project a fantasy on them, and then you fall in love with the fantasy. And aren't you stupid? Because you're going to find out that the match between your damn fantasy and the actual person is tenuous at best. And so Jung would call that a projection of either the anima or the animus. You know, the anima is what a man projects onto a woman he finds desirable. It's like, oh, she's the perfect woman. It's like, well, how do you know that? You've like seen her for 4 seconds, you know, but it grips you. And the same thing happens in the opposite direction. And it's an action of instinct, you know. It's like you fall in love with the image. But interestingly enough, what you do in a relationship that works is that you actually, I think that what you see, it's a rough approximation, when you project the ideal and fall in love with it, you see what could be. It could be that, but it's going to take you a hell of a lot of work, because like you got no shortage of flaws, and the other person has no shortage of flaws, and so you're bringing your flaws together, and that's going to produce a lot of friction, and you're going to have to engage in a lot of dialogue before you approach that level of perfection again. But maybe you can do it, and then you get to live happily ever after. Well, wouldn't that be nice? Well, so the unconscious meets the unknown, and it meets it with imagination and fantasy and dream and art. That's how you take, see, you don't just go from what you don't know to fully articulated knowledge in one bloody leap. You can't do that. You have to extend pseudopods of fantasy and imagination into the unknown. That's kind of what theorizing is like, right? Even scientifically, you know, you don't know something scientifically, you generate a theory. Well, it's an imaginative representation that your unconscious is helping you generate. And so you meet the unknown with fantasy. That's what the unconscious is for. From the psychoanalytic perspective, that's what dreams do. And you can see why. You dream about the future. You know, it's like, well, what's the future going to be like? Well, you have a little imaginative story going on, and it's like, you don't really create it. It's sort of, you watch it unfold. You know, maybe you can tweak it here and there, but it sort of comes to you from wherever the hell things like that come from. You know, the unconscious, that's the psychoanalytic answer. It's not really much of an answer, because it's more like a representation of a place that we don't understand. But that's where creativity comes from. And I mean, some people are really creative right down to the bloody core. So in my clinical practice, I often see people who are high in openness because they're attracted to me because they watch my lectures. And you have to kind of be high in openness to like my lectures. So because, well, you do, because they go everywhere, you know, and they're not necessarily very orderly. So anyways, lots of my clients are really high in openness, and they're funny people often, especially if they're smart, because sometimes they have the most nihilistic intelligence you can imagine. It's just self-critical and nihilistic and brutally brutal, man, and smart. And so they just criticize themselves out of existence. And so often I have to just try to get them to quit listening to their chattering self-critical rationality and go out and create something, you know, with their massive creativity. And as long as they're doing that, they're engaged in the world and happy as hell. But as soon as that self-critical rationality comes in and shuts down the creativity, they're just like walking corpses, you know. And it's because if you're really open, like you're a tree, and it has some trunks, and you know, your most prominent trait is the most lively trunk. And if you're a creative person and you're not engaging in a creative enterprise, you're like a tree that has had its vitality amputated. And so this is not trivial. This is deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in your biology. And those are people often who have like dream lives you just can't believe. I have one client, he has like 4 spectacular dreams a week, and most of the time we just spend discussing them. I mean, God. And I had another client who could be lucid in her dreams, which is more common among women. She could ask the damn characters what they represented, and they would tell her. It was like, Okay, that was pretty weird. And like a lot of the things they told her were really helpful, and they were not things that she wanted to hear. She basically, one of them told her if she was going to live, she'd have to go visit a slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was because she was raised as a little princess and protected from horrible Mother Nature until she hit puberty, in which time she turned into an evil villain, because that's how the family worked. Perfect child, evil teenager, overnight. And then, well, that was hard on her, and she wasn't prepared because she thought the world was princess world, and, you know, she couldn't go through a butcher store without having a fit. And no wonder, you know, like, really, Jesus, you know, it's no wonder, but you do it. But she couldn't, so we used to go to butcher stores, and that would make her cry, and that she was a vegetarian, that would make her cry, and, you know, bemoan the cruelty of the world. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, man, those are bloody slabs of meat. It's like, I don't know why everyone isn't screaming when they walk through the butcher store, but you got to get used to it, man, because you can't live in the world otherwise. And so the dream character, who was a gypsy, told her that she had to go visit a slaughterhouse, which seemed rather impractical. And so I asked her if she could think of anything else to do, and she thought, well, why don't we go visit a funeral home and watch an embalming? And I thought, oh, good. That sounds like a fun way to spend a day. And so I phoned up a funeral parlor, and I said I had a client who was terrified of death. Yeah, and I was a therapist who was also a little shaky on the concept myself. And so they had no problem with that. They deal with death all the time, which is really something to think about, right? A human being can actually have an occupation where they do nothing but deal with death, and they don't go stark raving mad. It's like, what the hell's up with that? It's like working in a palliative care ward where your clients that you know have a relationship, all they're going to do is die this week, next week, the week after. People do that. It's like, those people are tough, man. They're tough. So anyways, we went and watched this embalming, which was, I have a rather high level of disgust sensitivity, so it was a little on the rough side for me. But she sat there, and first while she was not, we were outside this little room, she was not looking at that, man, no way. Then she'd kind of go like this, and you know, that was pretty good. And then she'd go like this, and then she'd go like this, and then she watched it. And then she asked if she could go in, and she put on a glove and she touched the body, and she didn't have a fit, she didn't have a panic attack. And so she walked away from there learning that there was a hell of a lot more to her than she thought there was, and that she could see things that she didn't think she could see and live. And after that, she sort of had a touchstone. It's like, well, I'm kind of afraid of this. Well, is it as bad as going to see the embalming? No, it's not that bad. Well, I guess I can do it. It's like an initiation, right? She had an initiation. And so did I, you know. And I learned a lot from doing that. I learned that one of the things you need to do if you're going to be a human being is to prepare yourself to be useful in the face of death. And so when you have a parent that dies, which, you know, shatters people's ideas, often they can't even think about it. If you can't even think about that, man, you've got some thinking to do. Because you need to be able to at least think about that, because otherwise you're just going to be a wasteland when it happens. And you never know, you could even have a higher ambition. Maybe you could even be useful when it happens, instead of being part of the heap of destroyed people who also have to be taken care of. You know, and that's brutal. You have to be brutal to be useful in the aftermath of your parents' death. You know, you don't get to crumble and fall apart, and no, you have every reason to. So you got to be kind of some tough monster to manage that. But do you want to be useful in the face of tragedy, or do you want to be pathetic? Well, you make your choice. So out of the unconscious, you get ritual, you get dreams, you get drama, you get stories, you get art, you get music, and that sort of buffers us. We have our little domain of competence, and we're buffered by the domain of fantasy and culture. And that's really what you learn about when you come to university, if you're lucky, and the professors are smart enough to actually teach you something about culture instead of constantly telling you that it's completely reprehensible and should be destroyed. It's like, why you would prefer chaos to order is beyond me, and the only possible reason is that you haven't read enough history to understand exactly what chaos means. And believe me, if you understood what it means, you'd be pretty goddamn careful about tearing down the temple that you live in, unless you want to be a denizen of chaos. And some people do, you know, because that's when the impulses that you harbor can really come out and shine. And so a little gratitude is in order, and that makes you appreciative of the wise king, while being smart enough to know that he's also an evil tyrant. It's like that's a total conception of the world. It's balanced. It's like, yeah, we should preserve nature, but good God, it is trying to kill us. And you know, yes, our culture is tyrannical and oppresses people, but it is protecting us from dying. That's helpful. You know, and yes, we're reasonably good people, but like, don't take that theory too far until you've tested yourself. And you know, that's wisdom, at least in part, and that's what these stories try to teach you. There's a nice mythological representation. I love this one. It's like the dome of the known and the seeker looking outside. You know, that's a metaphysical representation. You know, and that is the world as it looks to us, right? You go out in a field and it looks like there's a dome covering it. It's a circle, a big circle with a dome over it, and you know, what's outside the dome? Well, the unknown, right? That's where heaven is, theoretically. You know, it's a projection, obviously. Heaven is in the unknown. Well, it was localized in space. I suppose that's partly because when people looked up in the sky, they were overwhelmed with awe. So it's a reasonable conclusion, you know. It's a projection of an unconscious presupposition. It's a projection of fantasy, you know. Heaven is a fantasy, and I'm not denigrating fantasy, by the way, and it's projected imaginatively onto the sky, and that's part of the way you discover what's in your fantasy. Well, this is us, man. We mediate between chaos and order, and you know, those are the two archetypal representations fundamentally, you know, and I think they apply to both genders. You know, like women can act as the individual who holds the world on his or her shoulders, and men can play a maternal role. You know, female human beings are quite masculine and male human beings are quite feminine. And so, you know, maybe this archetype dominates among men and that archetype dominates among women, which I would say is the case as far as I'm concerned, although there are individual conceptions, and of course those two things have to work in conjunction. But that's you, the eternal mediator between chaos and order, which also has its enemy. So that's Horus there, and that's Seth, who eventually turns into Satan as the West progresses, so to speak, and that's represented there as well. The temptations of, I would say, resentment and hatred, which everyone has to fight with all the time. All right, initiations. So this is cool. This is a standard hero story, and initiatory rites are a part of human heritage, and so let's take a look. This is from Eliade. I would like even now to stress the fact that the psychopathology of the shamanic vocation is not profane. It does not belong to ordinary symptomatology. It's not mental illness. It has an initiatory structure and signification. In short, it reproduces a traditional mystical pattern. The total crisis of the future shaman, sometimes leading to complete disintegration of the personality and to madness, can be evaluated not only as an initiatory death, but also as a symbolic return to the pre-cosmogonic chaos, to the amorphous and indescribable state that precedes any cosmogony. Well, what he means by that is that, I suppose, the mythological view of the emergence of order, that's a cosmogony, is that there's a state of potential and chaos out of which order emerges. And you know, here's how it is that you think that way, because you do think that way. So, you know, imagine what you're facing when you're facing the future, right? Well, you might say, well, the future is full of potential, right? It's full of potential. What the hell does that mean? You know, you act as if that potential is really a real thing, and you're confronting it all the time. I'm confronting the potential of the future. Well, it doesn't exist yet. So what you're confronting doesn't even really exist. What you're conceptualizing doesn't really exist. And in some sense, you bring it into being by plotting your path through it. Well, the pre-cosmogonic chaos is the same as the potential of the future. It's exactly the same idea. It's the realm of possibility from which actuality emerges. And you participate in turning that possibility into actuality. That's what you're doing all the time. Now, can I explain that? Well, no. I have no idea how consciousness and the substrate of the world interact. I can only say that that's how it looks. That's how it feels, you know. That's how people act, and they'll get into trouble if they don't manifest their potential, whatever that is. That's all those things you could be that you're not. Well, where are those? It's just potential. Well, that's the chaos. I would say that's the cosmos. That's the cosmos that you live in all the time. It's a little story. It's the thing that you extract out of the chaos. It sort of consists of your conception of where you are now and your conception of where you want to be at some point. Could be 10 minutes, could be 3 years. You can slide it. And then you have a little plan about how you should move your body to transform one into the other. That's your action pattern. That's a little story. And when you ask someone to say what they were up to, they'll tell you a little story like that. You know, I was at some place and I went somewhere else and here's how I did it. And then they might tell you a more interesting story, which is I was someplace and something happened that I really didn't expect, and it knocked me for a loop, you know. And that's a good divorce story. I came home one night and my wife was gone. It's like, yeah, chaos, and probably a bit of willful blindness preceding it, we might suspect. Anyways, down into chaos, and then, well, maybe you learn something down there, and maybe you don't, but hopefully you do, and you put yourself together if you're lucky, and then pop, bang, you pop up into another little structure of order. And that's an initiatory process. It's like you're somewhere stable, falls apart, or maybe you break it apart on purpose. You do it voluntarily, you know. People do that all the time. You know, they do that, for example, when they experiment with drugs, and they do that when they go on wild adventures, and, you know, when they break themselves out of their normal routine and throw themselves somewhere they don't understand and hope that that's going to produce a transformation of personality. That's the basic story. That's the initiatory story. Now, this is William James, who was one of the establishers of modern psychology, and a kind of an odd guy. He was an early experimenter with psychedelics. Of course, they'll never tell you that, but he was. And his drug of choice was nitrous oxide, which is an inhalant gas, which seems to be inert. No one really knows why it works, but it produces quite intense hallucinogenic experience, mystical experience. Although if you breathe too much of it, then you die because it doesn't have any oxygen in it. So don't do that. And he wrote some really bad hippie poetry back in the 1880s while he was, you know, experimenting with nitrous oxide. And I'll read a little bit of that to you. Pure experience is the name which I give to the original flux of life before reflection has categorized it. Only newborn babes and persons in semi-coma from sleep, drugs, illnesses, or blows can have an experience pure in the literal sense of a that which is not yet any definite what, though ready to be any sorts of whats, full both of oneness and of manyness, but in respects that don't appear, changing throughout, yet so confusedly that its phases interpenetrate, and no points either of distinction or of identity can be caught. 1905, William James, Journal of Philosophy. You know, a lot of these old guys that established what we regard as, you know, fairly stable bodies of knowledge were just as crazy as you can possibly imagine. They're just the most peculiar damn people, and they get sanitized, you know, as they are represented in history, and that's no fun. You know, I mean, it's much more interesting to know what they were like. They were just so bloody peculiar and strange and involved in all sorts of weird things. It's a lot more fun to know that. Here's his poem. Wow. It's like right from 1968. No verbiage can give it because the verbiage is other, incoherent, coherent, same, and it fades, and it's infinite, and it's infinite. Don't you see the difference? Don't you see the identity? Constantly opposites united. The same me telling you to write and not to write. Extreme, extreme, extreme. Something and other than that thing. Intoxication and otherness than intoxication. Every attempt at betterment, every attempt at otherment is it fades forever and forever as we move. It's just about as incoherent as postmodernist philosophy. So we know for archaic and traditional cultures that a symbolic return to chaos is equivalent to preparing a new creation. It follows that we may interpret the psychic chaos of the future shaman as a sign that the profane man is being dissolved and a new personality being prepared for birth. Transformation. Here's a way of thinking about it. Paradise. Paradise lost. Redemption. Classic story of mankind. Always. There was a great past. We're in a state of chaos. We're heading towards a better future. Everyone thinks that way. The stories are based on that. Well, that's that. Now, Ellen Berger, who wrote a lot about the psychoanalysts, believed that Freud and Jung in particular had a creative illness, which he regarded as a sort of spontaneous shamanic transformation. And he said, a creative illness has these elements. It succeeds a period of intense preoccupation with an idea and search for certain truth. It's a polymorphous condition that can take the shape of depression, neurosis, psychosomatic ailments, or even psychosis. Jung was in that state when he wrote this book called The Red Book, which was just released last year, which is full of visionary illustrations and very strange poetry. And it contains the communications he had with imaginative beings that he conjured up when practicing doing exactly that. He practiced that for years, and he had these autonomous beings manifest themselves in his fantasy and had long conversations with them. It just, while he was working as a doctor and having a sane, normal life, and well, it's kind of, it's really something. Whatever the symptoms they're felt as painful, well, he thought maybe he was going mad. And some people think he did. If not agonizing by the subject, with alternating periods of alleviation and worsening. Throughout the illness, the subject never loses the thread of his dominating preoccupation. It's often compatible with normal professional activity and family life. But even if he keeps to his social activities, he's almost entirely absorbed with himself. He suffers from feelings of utter isolation, even when he has a mentor who guides him through the ordeal, like the shaman apprentice with his master. The termination is often rapid and marked by a phase of exhilaration. The subject emerges from his ordeal with a permanent transformation in his personality and a conviction that he has discovered a great truth or a new spiritual world. Many of the 19th and 20th century figures regarded universally as great, Nietzsche, Darwin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Freud, Jung, were all additionally characterized by lengthy periods of profound psychological unrest and uncertainty. Well, you don't generate a new theory without some birth pangs, right? Because your old theory has to bite the dust first, and when your old theory bites the dust, it's like, where are you? You don't know. Do you know if you're going to come up with a new one? No. Here's a cool thing. This is my daughter. She was 5 years at this point. She was playing Prince and Princess with Julian, her 3-year-old. She said, "Dad, if we killed a dragon, we could use his skin as armor. Wouldn't that be a good idea?" I thought, hey, yeah, that's a hell of an idea, kid. You go right after the thing that frightens you the most, and you develop something, armor. William, daughter. Well, you don't generally carelessly as by she dragon. We could idea, kid. You go right after the thing that frightens you the most, and you develop something that protects you from doing that. It's like, where did she get that idea? Well, good work, kiddo. She had plenty of dragons in her life. So, the following dream was described by my daughter, Michaela, 3 years, 9 months old, about my son, Julian, 1 year. Julian was in the process of toilet training and rapid speech development and was having some trouble controlling his emotions. Michaela liked to call him baby. We had several discussions about the fact that he wasn't really a baby anymore. She told me this story while I was at the computer, so I was able to get it verbatim. She wasn't very happy with the idea that he wasn't a baby anymore because she kind of liked the baby. She took care of that baby a lot, and her little brain was having a hard time with the notion that whatever that thing is now, it isn't a baby. It's like, well, where's my baby? And believe me, plenty of mothers go through the same thing. Then they attempt to keep their children babies for the rest of their lives. So this is what Michaela said, the dream. Julian's eyes fell out, and then he fell into pieces. I said, what sort of pieces? She said, Julian pieces. And the bones falled out too. Then a hole got him and there was water in it, and when he came out he was big. Mom, Julian isn't a baby anymore? No, he's a big boy. And a bug with legs got him out, because bugs can swim. And the hole was in the park. And it moved into the backyard and he falled into it. A tree burned and left the hole. I thought, wow, that's so amazing. It's like, it was a shamanic transformation dream. It was like the tree, that's the tree of life. It burnt and left a hole. The kid fell into it. It dissolved him right down to his bones. This little bug, which would be a Jungian representation of the self, like Jiminy Cricket, by the way, in Pinocchio. The bug was the thing that was alive that helped him through the transformation. He stepped out and now he was big. It's like that was her little brain conjuring up the notion of radical transformation. So this is cool. I hope this works. This is a dream that my nephew had that someone animated.
Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist from the University of Toronto. Now, I do disagree with some of his fundamental ideas, but his thoughts on facing problems merge with my Stoic values. Within one of his Maps of Meaning lectures, he tells a true story about a 4-year-old boy, his nephew, who for months was suffering from terrible night terrors, terrors that were waking him up screaming. This boy, by the way, did have some areas of instability in his family life. Jordan visited the young boy's house, and the boy was running around dressed as a knight with a sword, a shield and a helmet. At night time he would take his sword and shield to bed. So Jordan got speaking to him, and the boy described his dream. In the dream, he is standing surrounded by knee-high dwarfs. These dwarfs had beaks, and every time he would try to move, the dwarfs would jump up and bite him. A very frightening scenario for a young boy. And if you look behind all the dwarfs, away in the background there was a dragon. And every time this dragon would puff out fire and smoke, more dwarfs would be created. So there's no point fighting off the dwarfs, because more would just be made. So Jordan tapped him and asked, what could you do about that? So the kid says he could jump up on the dragon's head. He could poke out his eyes with his sword so he couldn't see. Then he could go down the throat to the box where the fire came from, carve a piece out of that box, thereby destroying it, and use that piece as a shield. The child, before Jordan arrived, was already acting out in life what he knew he had to do. And after that conversation, he had no more night terrors. This is what Marcus Aurelius meant when he said, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. He was telling us that we must not shy away from problems or shun our personal responsibility. We must be willing to sacrifice our comfort, go to the source of our problems to solve them, and then take something away.
Well, there you go. So, yeah, he was waking up screaming at night for weeks. That's night terrors. He couldn't really remember what the hell was going on. And there was instability in his family. His parents got divorced soon after, and he was off to kindergarten, and that was kind of destabilizing him too. And so it was fun to watch him zip around as a knight. It's like, you know, where did he get that idea? Well, you know, he watched TV, he watched movies. His little imagination was aggregating the picture of the hero, and then he was trying to act it out. That's what he was doing, pretending, right? I'm pretending to be the thing that takes on the unknown. And then he has this amazing dream. It's like, it's mind-boggling. It's so sophisticated. It's like, well, here I am, and there's troubles everywhere, and they're biting me. They're jumping up on me. And it's like a hydra. You know, in the hydra, you cut off a hydra's head and 7 more heads grow. It's like, that's life, man. Solve one problem, 7 more appear, right? So, well, so that was the dragon at the background. Chaos itself, and chaos kept breeding these evil little dwarfs, which is what it does. It's like, it's one damn trouble after another. You fight this one off, fight this one off. It's like, who cares? The dragon, the dwarf generating machine is still working in the background. So I asked him, and that was purposeful. What could you do? See, that's a leading question. That implies that there's something that he could do. He said, well, I'd take my dad, that was missing in the animation, and we'd go, well, poke the dragon's eyes out, go right down to the source of the problem, extinguish it, make a shield, right? So that meant that he would have strengthened his character by the encounter. So, brilliant. And I talked to his mom for months afterwards. Done. No more night terrors. What had happened? He identified with the mythological hero. He identified with St. George and the dragon. He identified with that little bloody tree-dwelling primate who 20 million years ago was the first one to drop a stick on a snake. He adopted the classic human mode of being in the face of uncertainty and construed himself as that which could prevail. End of terrors. Well, I guess we're done, eh? So we're going to do something a little different than the syllabus today, because you know we've got this 1 hour, 2 hour problem, and I really can't cover constructionism reasonably in 2 hours, 1 hour. That was supposed to be today. So what I'm going to do instead is continue on the line that I've been pursuing, but I'm going to expand it up more into Jungian psychology, which is what we're going after constructivism anyways. And so I can weave the constructivism and the depth psychology together, and it's nice to do that because it gives you a kind of a coherent view. So just so you know, we're one lecture ahead at the moment, roughly speaking, and I'll do constructivism on Tuesday for 2 hours. So all right, so I showed you that animation. I told you about my nephew's dream, which is a remarkable dream, you know, really. It's just amazing, amazing dream. And it's got this archetypal pattern, you know, and the pattern is that there's a threat, and worse than that, that there are threats, and at the back of it there is the fact of threat itself. You see, so human beings, we're so smart, hey? So this is so amazing that we figured this out. So you imagine, well, human beings are the only creatures that can really conceive of the class of all threatening things, right? And that's kind of why we can be permanently anxious. So it's sort of annoying. So, you know, here you are, and it's safe. There's no lions here or anything that might prey on you. But you can think of something to be anxious about, no problem, you know. I'm certain you've got some little skeleton rattling around in your closet somewhere that's like eating away at you. And so I think part of the reason we're so damn awake, human beings, is because we're always anxious. And you have to be awake when you're anxious. And the anxiety system actually activates your reticular activating system, and that actually produces, it's the substrate for consciousness. If you snap a few fibers in the back of your brain that are part of the reticular activating system in a car accident or something, you'll go into a coma, and that'll be that. You're not getting out of it. Doesn't take much of an injury either in the right place. So anyways, so human beings have been struggling with this problem of threat forever, really, for as long as there's been life, or at least as long as there's been life with a nervous system, and you know, that's several 100 million years. It's a long time. And of course, it's easy to, you know, to respond to a particular threat. Think about zebras. They're out there on the veldt, and there's lions everywhere, right? But the zebras are like, they're calm because their lions are sleeping, and so the zebras don't think, apparently, oh my God, what was going to happen when those lions wake up, because they don't think that way, you know, and they're not going to be happy if the lion goes into a hunting crouch and starts its hunting approach, obviously. But it's not like the zebras are freaking out non-stop because there are lions around, you know. So they can react to specific threats, but human beings, partly because we discovered the future, which was a big mistake. It was a big mistake because the future is an uncertain place. We realized that, well, there isn't any threat right now, but there might well be some tomorrow. And if there isn't some tomorrow, well, maybe next week or next month or next year, like it's coming. And so there's danger. So it's the category of danger, you know. And out of the category of danger emerge specific threats. And the dragon seems to be a symbol of, it is a symbol, I believe, of the ever-present fact of predatory, slightly predatory threat. But our nervous systems, as they've become capable of abstraction, have used that underlying architecture to represent more abstract categories. So it's not a predator, like a dragon is not a predator because there are no dragons, but maybe a dragon is a snake and a crocodile and maybe a leopard and maybe a predatory bird, all mangled into one monster, because a monster is actually technically something that's made out of disparate parts. And so it's a good symbolic representation for the unknown as such, that which lies beyond the campfire, let's say, and what lurks out there. And so the eternal problem is, what the hell do you do with the dragon? And that also explains why the dragon typically is a treasure guarder, right? Because it's even more, the problem is even worse. Out there in no man's land, out there in potential, there's threat and like mortal threat, but there's also endless opportunity and riches and wealth and the possibility of attracting someone and all of that. And so, well, the dragon, you can't just be afraid of it, you just stay in your burrow the whole time. And lots of animals more or less do that, you know, especially the nocturnal ones, they just hide away. But that isn't what human beings are like, because we're not only prey animals, right? We're also predators. And then, of course, we're crazy. We're absolutely insane chimpanzees, right? We're crazy. And so we're always out there mucking about with things and with our, you know, fingers and our thumbs and taking the world apart and putting it back together. And we're crazily exploratory and troublemaking. And so we don't just run from dragons, we go hunt them down. And so there's a story here. There's the oldest story that mankind knows, and literally it is the oldest story that we know, is this story. And the story basically is, there's a bounded space, a walled garden, a walled city, you know, and all the original cities were walled, because if they weren't, barbarians would swoop in and they'd just steal all your stuff. And so, you know, that was kind of pointless. So, you know, you wanted to have some major league walls surrounding your territory, and so that's inhabited space, and inside that is your little dominance hierarchy. And so all you primates knew exactly who was who inside that space, so you didn't have to fight with each other, and you could predict each other's behavior because you believed the same things and saw the world roughly the same way and acted the same way, and so you were sort of secure. But then the problem is that that can always be breached. There's always something outside of it that's a danger, and so that's signified by this little creature here, this dragon. And that twirl in its tail is very common among dragons. It's actually a symbol, because imagistic languages, imagistic symbols have an ancient language, and it's referring to something that's basically eternal. And see, it lives down here in this cave, because it's an underground thing. It's an underground thing, and you can kind of imagine what that's like. And sometimes this happens in initiation rituals among archaic people. When they're going to initiate, usually the young men, because nature initiates women all by itself, usually the young men, maybe they'll put them in a cave and leave them there, you know, for like, well, who knows how long. And so you've got to think, what's in a cave? Now, caves are dark, man. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but like, they're dark, and they're really dark. And so not only is there whatever there is in the cave, and you don't know what the hell's in the cave, there's whatever you imagine might be in the cave. And so when you're in that cave and you're alone, you're confronting the devils and demons and monsters of your own imagination, you know. And so then you have a chance to perhaps deal with that and overcome it, and that's perhaps part of the initiation ceremony, you know, and that's part of growing up, because you have to learn how to face the things that terrify and upset you and recast them and put them back together. We talked a little bit about this idea of the pre-cosmogonic chaos that Iliad refers to, and that's the stuff out of which order is produced at the beginning of time, and it's also the stuff out of which you constantly reproduce order. And the Jungians, the psychoanalysts, especially the really deep psychoanalysts like Jung, Freud was a more surface psychoanalyst, and that's not an insult. There's some things that Freud figured out that are absolutely amazing. He was a precursor to Jung for sure. For Jung, the hero's journey was the journey inside the unconscious, and that would be perhaps in some sense that the willingness to face everything terrible that's happened to you, and to think it through and to articulate it, and to come to grips perhaps with your own capacity for malevolence. That was a really important part of Jungian ideas, that the first step towards individuation, which is the manifestation of your full self, let's say, was the discovery of your shadow. And your shadow is the part of you that will do terrible things under the right circumstances, and maybe even without that much provocation. And you know, and it's a terrifying part of you to come into contact with, because it's sort of the way that you're specifically attached to the archetype of evil. That's a good way of thinking about it. And you know, modern people, they don't really think much about the idea of good and evil, but that's because most of them are so damn naive, you can just barely even comprehend it. You know, if you read any history, if you really read it, like, and you don't come away with the idea that evil exists, it's like you're just reading the wrong kind of history, you know. It's just unbelievable what people can do to each other. And we're so imaginative, you know. And one of the things I figured out about people, the reason that we have the knowledge of good and evil, let's say, is that because we're self-conscious and we know about ourselves, we know about our own vulnerability, right? You know what hurts you. You really know what hurts you, way more than an animal knows. And so, and you're also creative, and so once you know what hurts you, man, you can really hurt someone else. And you can do it in such a creative way. You can draw it out. You can make it excruciating. You can take people apart physically and psychologically. And you can keep them, say, even right on the edge of death, so that you can keep doing that endlessly. And, you know, that happens. A hell of a lot more than you think it happens. It happens a lot. And so, well, and you think, well, you know, that doesn't involve me. It's like, oh yes it does, man. That's the problem, because, you know, you're human, and that's the sort of things that human beings are capable of. And I'm not saying it's all probable that you do that ever, or that, but I'm saying that, you know, you got to take that into account. When you're looking at the world and you think about all the perpetrators out there, it's like, it's not like there's perpetrators and there's victims. That isn't how it works. It doesn't work that way at all. And so the horrors of humanity, as well as the noble elements of humanity, are all elements of your central being. And for Jung, and this is the terrible thing, for Jung, the pathway to higher wisdom was through the terrible portal of, well, you could say hell, for that matter. Really. And so who wants to do that, man? It's like, no. You know, like maybe you're resentful about something. Well, you probably are, because like everybody's resentful about something, you know. And resentment is just a vicious emotion. It's really useful. It's really useful, because if you're resentful about something, it either means that you should grow the hell up and accept the responsibility and quit sniveling around and whining, or it means that someone actually is oppressing you and pushing on you too hard and bullying you and demeaning you, and you have something to say or do that you're not saying or doing. And no wonder you're not saying or doing it, because, you know, it can be really dangerous to say things or do them to free yourself from being oppressed. You can get in a lot of trouble in the short term for doing it, so it's easier just to not say anything, sort of day after day. In the short term you protect yourself, but it just crushes you. And then the resentment comes up, and resentment, man, that can just get so out of hand, you know. It starts with resentment, and then it goes to the desire for revenge, you know, because you'll play nasty little tricks on the person that's oppressing you. At any chance you'll talk about them behind their back, and if they want you to do something, you'll do it badly, or you'll do it grudgingly, or you'll do a half-rate job, and you'll set up little traps, and, you know, so it puts you in a poisonous space. And then if you really start to dwell on that, say, in your basement for 3 or 4 years about just exactly how terrible the world is, and how that's focused on you, and how everyone's rejected you, and how you get to this point where you're thinking that, you know, existence itself is a kind of poisonous endeavor, and that the best thing for you to do is go out there and do as much, you know, create as much mayhem as you possibly can. And if you really get to a dark place, you think, I'm going to create as much mayhem as I possibly can by targeting the most innocent thing I can possibly imagine. And then you end up shooting kids in Connecticut. And that's how you get there. And so that's a bad road, man. There's dark things down there. But you can go there, and people do. And they go through the hole of resentment. And so resentment can tell you, you've got something to say. You bloody well better say it. You gotta free yourself from what's oppressing you. You have to stand up for that, because otherwise you become oppressed. And then once you're oppressed, that's just not so good. And so, like in your marriage and your relationships, you got to tell people what you're thinking. You don't have to assume you're right. That's a whole different story, because you're not, because you're, you know, ignorant, and you're biased, and, you know, so you're not right, but you can stumble towards the expression of yourself, and then you can listen to the other person and hope that they tell you some way that you're stupid that's useful, so you can be a little less stupid in the future, because wouldn't that be good? And so, you know, you go after the unknown. You don't protect what you know. You already know what you know. You go after what you don't know. That's why you have to talk to people you don't agree with. That's why you have to talk to your enemies, because they're going to tell you things you don't know. You could even listen to them. It's possible they know a thing or two you don't know. But people don't like that, you know. They just talk to people who think the same way, and then they just stay stupid. And so that's, And that's not good, because if you're not wise, the world will wallop you, it'll flatten you, and far more than it has to. And then you'll be bitter and resentful, and you'll be part of that force that wallops instead of the force that fights against that. So, well, so you go after the dragon, and that's what this guy is doing. He's going after the dragon. It's threatening the society, because it always does. Chaos, what's outside of order, always threatens order. Always. Always. And so you have to step forward, you know, in this manner, voluntarily, and go after that when it's still manageable, right? And that's the case in your own life too. So, you know, if you've had a proclivity to be bullied in the past, you know, and you want to get out of that, what you have to do is you have to make yourself awake to the what would you say, to the initial stages of that sort of bullying emerging in your life again, that sort of domination, and you have to step forward against it when it's still in its developing stages, because maybe you can just not have it happen. That would be better. And so you have to be ready to speak what you have to say more or less on a moment's notice. You can't be impulsive about it. You know, like if you and I are talking and you make a mistake, or I make a mistake, even if it bothers one or the other of us, we should just write it off, because it's like one encounter. What the hell? You know, maybe we had a bad night's sleep or something, you know. So you got to be a little forgiving. But if it happens twice, then, you know, you should be a little awake, and you should remember both times. And then if it happens a third time, it's like that's when you act, and you say, look, we talked and this happened, and I thought, yeah, whatever, but then you did it again, and then you just did it again. Well, then the person is basically like, what are they going to do, you know? No, well, maybe they might argue with you, but you kind of got them. And generally, if you just point that out to people, just like that, just that you noticed and are willing to say something about it, they'll back the hell off. They'll often apologize. And sometimes you even make them a little more conscious, which is like, hey, that's not such a bad idea. And that's what all this means. And so this chaos idea, so for Jung, it was the unconscious, right? It was the contents of your unconscious. And so that might be the unknown past, the threatening past that you have never dealt with. Might be the threatening future. It might be the threatening present. But Jung realized as he got older that the unconscious was also the world. And you think, and so the chaos is not only your unconscious mind, which meets the unknown, but it's actually the unknown itself mingled together. And you think, what the hell does that part? That's why the dragon is a land creature and an air creature. It's matter and spirit at the same time. And this sort of gets us into constructivism. Because the constructivists think that basically what happens is that you encounter those elements of the world that don't fit into your theory, and out of those new elements you make the world through your perceptions, and you make yourself by incorporating the information and transforming yourself. And that's how Piaget explains the development of a child. The child starts out with some reflexes, basic reflexes, and manifesting the reflexes produces results in the world, and then the child has to reorganize its perceptions to take into account the transformations, and so then it gets a little more sophisticated, and then it can do a few more things, and then it can manifest more changes in the world, and then it tracks them and modifies its perceptions and actions to account for them, and it just keeps doing that, and that's how the child boots itself up like a computer does. It's a very cool idea. And so from the Piagetian stance, so it's a constructivist stance, you could think of the world as a latent pool of information. It's something like that, with a structure, obviously, that you can interact with your little fingers and your body and your mind and your eyes and your mouth, and you make changes happen, and you track them, and you model them, and you build your skills, and as you continue to do that in the safety of your house, initially under the care of your parents who fill in where you're ignorant, you just emerge more and more competent and confident and ready to move ahead. So that's how the constructivist idea works. And so there's kind of a chaos idea at the bottom of that, which is that out of which you emerge and the world emerges at the same time. Because, you know, you don't see reality. Not at all. You see almost like an animated version of reality, you know. Like when I look at you, I just see the front of you. I just see the outside of you. I see you at this height. I don't see any of your internal structure. I don't see the back part of you at all. I don't see your family. I don't see your history. I don't see your future. You know, I just see this slice of you. You're so complicated. I just see this little like oversimplified slice of you right now, and I think that's the reality. And it's sort of the reality, the way that a Simpsons character is you. It's like, it's sort of like you, and it's enough so that you can watch the story, but the real you, man, God only knows what that is. And that's a Jungian idea, you know, that the real you is something that radically transcends your perception of yourself or your conception of yourself, and that you get to that higher you, at least in part, by going into the darkest place. And so it's a hell of an idea, man. It's really, but it's the old idea of initiation. It's as old as time, that idea. And there's something to it, and we definitely recreate it in psychotherapy. Like, this isn't an airy theory. It's quite the contrary, because what you do as a psychologist, always, a behaviorist, say that the most logical, clinical type of psychologist, a behaviorist is an initiatory shaman, even though he or she doesn't know it, because what they do is they say, okay, well, let's take a look at your life. Like, okay, you got a bunch of problems, and they're like massive dragons, and you're just like, you're not going anywhere with those problems. You're just cowering in the corner. And what the behavior therapist does is cut that dragon into those little dwarfs until the dwarfs are small enough so that you can really kick the hell out of them. And so, by the way they do that is they take the problem and they decompose it into elements that are small enough that you have a reasonable probability of mastering them. So you take the problem apart into its micro problems, careful analytic process. And then you think, okay, well, how could we progress a little bit this week? And some of that is to practice facing things you're afraid of. So like if you're agoraphobic and you can't get on an elevator, you can't get on a taxi, and you can't stand up to your husband, and I'm saying husband because most agoraphobics are women, most of them are middle-aged women, and most of them were too dependent for most of their life. So that's a monster. It's like society, husband, elevator, taxi, subway. It's a monster, and it's that place you will not go. And that's because you feel this high and everything else looks this big. And so, and partly that's because you've run away, and when you run away from something, it grows and chases you, which is, well, it's exactly what happens to a prey animal, man. If you go in the woods and you find a bear, especially a grizzly, well, you're in real trouble if it's a grizzly. But if it's a black bear, you know, generally speaking, if you stand your ground and make a hell of a lot of noise, that thing will leave you alone. But if you run, well, what's it supposed to think? It eats things that run from it. So that's exactly where that idea come from. You turn tail and run, and then the thing that you're afraid of is really a monster, and it's going to like get you and eat you. It's like, well, that's true psychologically as well. And the same circuits that we used to, when we were, you know, out in the forest, even in trees, the same circuits that we used to parse up the world then into safe territory and place where the predators loom, is the way we parse up the world now, which is safe territory and the place where the predators loom. It's just become abstracted, way up, abstracted way up. So, but it's the same damn circuits. We know this. Like, the same circuits you use to forage for information, which is dopaminergic circuit, is the circuit that squirrels use to forage for nuts. And you think, well, why? Well, it's because there's no difference between information and food. Like, you trade information for food all the time. That's what you're doing when you're working, especially if you're working on a computer. So the idea that there's an equation between information and food, it's like, well, obviously there's an equation between them. So of course you'd use the same circuits. And I mean, the damn squirrel has to remember where the nuts are. And so for him, information is food even. So, and what happened to human beings is that we started thinking, hey, maybe it's better to go after information than it is to go after food. Because going you.